the journalist Peter Oborne. Please give him a big...
Thank you very much indeed for those kind words, Nicholas, and thank you very much for coming on this beautiful, sunny Saturday afternoon. It's a most incredibly beautiful place, and I'm really privileged to be here to speak to you. It's so moving being here because of the many reasons, but the reminder of looking at the ruins around us and the circumstances of the Reformation, of the violence and hatred that can be generated by religion, but also the beauty and the peace. And I want to set out by framing what I will say this afternoon with a thought that even though we live in we officially have a state church, a state religion in Britain, actually, in effect, the real state religion, or state ideology even, in this country, is secular liberalism. That is the state religion of Britain today. And across much of the West, and if you look at if you make a comparison between the values of state religion, so secular liberalism, and all religions, whether they might be Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, that they are driven by a different sort of basis. Secular liberalism is really, I think, about two things. One is individual rights, that defines their identity. Whereas religions are about much more than just individual rights. They're about our duties to others, so compassion, and I think the sense of the sacred, our relationship to the past. And you can see these conflicting, they needn't necessarily be in conflict, these different types of interpreting the world, but very often they are. Recently, we've seen that in the Scottish elections for the replace Nicola Sturgeon, that the religious belief coming into conflict with public identity. In Batley a few years ago, not far from here, with the issue of teaching in schools, and it's a very profound a difference, and any manifestation of religious belief can find itself in sometimes violent contradiction with the official doctrine of our time. Secular liberalism is against all religions in the sense that it will not allow them to occupy any position in the public space. And that applies to Christianity as well. But in particular, at the moment, it applies to Islam and to Muslims. I think that if you look at the reasons for this, you can say that Muslims are very often of a different color. They are immigrants, and there is a long tendency now, for which you trace back through English, British history, of minorities to be picked upon and hated. In the Middle Ages, notoriously, it was the Jews who were expelled, of course, by Edward I at the end of the 13th century. More recently, you've seen the same. Irish have occupied that position. Germans at certain stages. When I was a young man, the hatred ventilated against the gay community in this country, and and that has gone away. But at the moment, and this has been the case for the last 20 to 30 years, the most vulnerable community has been Muslims. Returning to my framework, secular liberalism, they also tend to believe more profoundly in God. Speaking as an Anglican, and I probably offend Nicholas, and definitely my wife, Anglicanism doesn't make the same demands. You can be an Anglican and not believe in God in many ways. Queen Elizabeth I, it's extraordinary that to be a great monarch, you have the greatest two monarchs in our history have both been called Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeths. She said that we did not want windows in men's souls, which gives a degree of quite deliberately a degree of latitude. But Islam makes more profound demands on faith, and Muslims have very publicly and privately have deeper commitments. I'm going to say something else, by the way, at this point, which will definitely offend my wife. I think it would anyway. She's not here. She was going to come, but she had to take the service tomorrow. It's a long way from London. We all worship the three monotheistic religions of the emerged in the Middle East, the same God, the God of Abraham, him or her, we all worship that God. And in the same way, I think, remarkably, the theology of, we can talk about this later, and I'm slightly stretching beyond my expertise, but the theology of Islam is remarkably similar to the theology of Judaism and of Christianity, particularly certain trends or traditions within Christianity and Judaism. And I feel that we have far more in common than we have, which we theologically and in the true teachings of religion apart. Jesus said, we must love our neighbors as ourselves. And the Prophet Muhammad said just the same thing, and so do the great Jewish sages, and that is and the rest is just doctrine or teaching. Love for neighbor is the essential teaching of these three religions, and yet in the British public discourse, and this is something I've studied very carefully for the last 2 decades, ever since I sensed there was something wrong at the time of the Iraq War in the way in which we talked about our fellow human beings, has been constructed to make out that Muslims or are different somehow from us and a threat to us and are not part of the same humanity. And I was a political journalist, I still am perhaps, but I was 20 years ago. I was political editor of The Spectator, and I watched the circumstances which gave rise to the Iraq War and then the aftermath. And I was able to, as a Spectator was a conservative paper, so I was able to watch with a remarkable, privileged position the arguments inside the Conservative Party. I then went on to the Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph, and I watched the construction of a new security architecture and language about Muslims. There was also a political battle involved. This happened when David Cameron became Tory leader. He set out by welcoming Muslims, being warm about Islam, visited a mosque, and he promoted actually Saeed Avasi to the shadow cabinet. And there was a battle between Saeed Avasi's generous interpretation and David Cameron's generous interpretation of Islam, and a much narrower interpretation, which is the one which won, which was led by Michael Gove, who's still around. And broadly, Saeed Avasi was lost. And Gove had an intellectual secretariat which continues the Policy Exchange think tank, and then also the Henry Jackson Society think tank. You probably don't hear about them, but they're enormously influential in constructing a new discourse about Islam, and they have won. I am going to, and you can't challenge this, and this is now the dominant orthodoxy inside the Conservative government. I'm going to talk a little bit about this orthodoxy. And the first thing is I'm going to note and try and describe an entirely new political language which has emerged in the last 15 years to describe Muslims. And it's important that you should know what this language is, because you'll find it in all conservative newspapers, every group. You will find it it's now entered government. It becomes part of the framing documents. It's part of the prevent strategy. It's all over the recent Shawcross report, which was a fantastically ignorant document published by somebody unqualified to do the job. Suella Braverman would always use this language as a matter of course, as would any Conservative minister, and mainly the Labour side wouldn't challenge it either. But it needs deconstruction. And the first term is extremist, which it is used in connection with Muslims. The second term is Islamist. The third term is moderate. The fourth term is radicalization. And the next one is non-violent extremists, a very new one, that. And finally, I'm going to come on to the term fundamental British values. You'll hear this, you'll always hear these terms being used by government spokesmen, by experts on Islam, by policymakers on the BBC all the time. And it's now been normalized, used by journalists. The first thing about is the word extremist. It's a very dangerous word. I decided that in order to understand it better, I'd research it through using the Hansard, very good Hansard search machine. And actually, it's been used. The first use I found was by a certain Viscount Hemsley, probably came from this part of the world. In about 1911, he died actually on the Western Front a few years later. And he was using this about these women called suffragettes. And these women wanted the vote. And they were extremists. Viscount Hemsley warned his fellow MPs in the House of Commons against these extremist women. Very soon, of course, the women did get the vote, and if you were now to argue that women shouldn't have the vote, I can assure you, you would be known as extremists. Then the next use of it was in connection with these appalling people, really menacing people, called advocating Indian independence. And these were extremists. Nowadays, again, if you were to advocate the reconquest of India, I dare say that you would be regarded. The word extremist is really a word which means heretic. It's people who don't agree with the conventional wisdom of the age. And you will now find, and this is part of official government language, the same term used against any Muslim who she or he wants to engage in public as a Muslim, representing Muslim ideas and issues. She or he will be known as an extremist or possibly an Islamist. Or if they're really going for them, they'll call them an extreme Islamist or a Muslim extremist or something like that. You're familiar with the language. And again, an Islamist is used, and this is something to warn you, because all politicians now will say that we've got to warn against Islamism. And then you will hear them saying, lumping together ISIS, Al-Qaeda, with political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood, Ennahda in Tunisia, or the Brotherhood in Egypt, etc. These are peaceful movements, engaging in politics from a Muslim perspective, like the Christian Democrats would in Germany. And yet the politicians will now just lump Ennahda in Tunisia, which is having a terrible time, with ISIS, which is a nihilistic death cult. And that kind of language is very, very confusing, particularly for people who don't know much about the subject, because it terrifies you. You have to have spent, as I did, an awful lot of time working out what's going on in order to know that this language is false and misleading. And the next one, though, is I find the most sinister is this concept of non-violent extremism. And it's scattered all over government documents and shapes the thinking behind the PREVENT strategy, which is a system of state spying, as far as I can tell, very often mainly on children, or to a very large extent on children who suddenly find them say something sort of unwise, age 14. I used to say a lot of things unwise long after I was 14, and then you're hauled up in front of some PREVENT officer and being interrogated about what you said about Palestine, or why you suddenly getting a bit religious. Now, this is but non-violent extremism. The first point about it is that it's a new category. It's a new word, first used by Theresa May in 2014. And we used to think, rather celebrate non-violent political movements in this country. It was a rather good thing that people who felt strongly about this, that, or the other, whether it was maybe challenging nuclear doctrines, stop the war in 2003. Turned out that they were justified, by the way. Or the Bertrand Russell leaving get rid of the bomb or whatever. These the current environmentalists who are concerned about climate change. They might even have a point, but they are now. These are non-violent extremists, and the concept of the terrorism is being expanded way beyond, stopping bombers who want to kill and maim, to governing or trying to restrict and criminalize political action, non-violent, the miners and the picket line in the 1980s. It's a movement towards a form of authoritarianism. Another word I want to just watch out when you come across radicalization. It's a piece of spurious, quasi-scientific nonsense used and constructed by intellectuals working for think tanks. Nobody knows who they are actually, or who owns them, funds them. To move this journey from the blessed condition, if you're a Muslim, of being a moderate, to the terrifying position where you're a radical or a radical extremist or extremist radical or a Muslimistic, and therefore liable to let off a bomb. Now, the science behind this is very unclear, widely contested, and I just like to note the racism of it. So if you're a white politician, say Jeremy Hunt, and he called himself, you said of Mr. Hunt that he was moderate. You mean he's not much good? He's rather sort of dull, very moderate performer. You use this term of a black or a Muslim politician. He's moderate. You mean he's very good, very good egg. He's one of us. You can trust him. Whereas if you say to a white British politician, she or he's a radical, well, got a bit of interesting, radical. He's challenging conventional ideas. Say of a Muslim or a black boy is a radical. Oh, don't go near him, lock him up. And this is a very interesting new kind of language we have developed. It is also used in connection with the final phrase I want to get on with. It's another new phrase. It's called it's the various versions of it, but it's fundamental British values. British values. The people who have constructed this new language have had some difficulty in defining British values. They go to freedom of speech and liberty, rule of law. They have quite a lot of difficulty there explaining why these are British values opposed to sort of Western values or general values. Well, I mean, any decent country has these values, not just Britain. And they use, but this is of course, they desperately need this concept because they're trying very hard to define extremism. Extremism is just a perspective, really. And an extremist is defined as somebody who rejects fundamental British values. It's obvious to me that the people who have constructed this language, and indeed, and this is not simply conservative politicians, are themselves attacking fundamental British values, and that they are themselves, in their own terms, extremists. Because what they are trying to do, and doing very successfully, and have been creating a security architecture for British Muslims and also other dissident, sort of a number of other groups, is using the concept of fundamental British values to restrict freedom of speech. You can't say all kinds of things now as a Muslim. You can't. I test you. You can feel free to challenge me, but the idea of Sharia law, as properly understood, as taught by the Prophet, you or me may not agree with this, but within the law of the land, to advocate, as the last Archbishop, the one with the beard, that rather distinct. What? Yeah, and thank you very much indeed, Rector. He's still about, and he's made a defense of Sharia law, Sharia courts operating within the British law. Or you can argue, if you want, for a caliphate, as far as I'm concerned, so long as you do it non-violently. You can make the case. And that, for me, is perfectly reasonable. It is within British tradition that we respect, or no, we don't have to respect them, but we have to allow people to make arguments which we disagree with and represent traditions which we dislike. That's all I'm trying to. I'm not arguing. And so we've always tolerated. And it's been one of the absolutely fantastic things about being British. The eccentric, the frankly dotty, the person who disagrees profoundly with public opinion, who bangs on about stuff which we don't understand or don't want to understand. And it's intolerant not to allow them to do that. And it's against, above all, we allowed Karl Marx. I actually suspect maybe due for a bit of a revival before long. We allowed Karl Marx, to flee the German Free Frankfurt or wherever he was, and come and live in London in the British Museum and construct that literary masterpiece known as Das Kapital. And I think that reflects rather well on us. We allowed refugees to come from all kinds of traditions and live here, so long as they do it without threatening violence or law of an order. They're extraordinarily welcome in this country. In my understanding of the history, but basically what we're about is supporting the underdog, or allowing. And that's when we're at our best. That's what we did in 1940. And we're a place where people who are dissident, radical, troublemaking, can come and know that they can go about their business peacefully and with respect. That's part of what it is to be British. Jeremy Corbyn was one of these. He's very much in this tradition of what A.J.P. Taylor, the great Oxford historian of the last century, called troublemakers. Keir Hardie would have been a troublemaker. He wouldn't have been allowed, by the way, Keir Hardie wouldn't be allowed in today's Labour Party. He founded it, but he would not be allowed in Keir Starmer's Labour Party. The same could be said of George Lansbury, or Noureddin Bhavan, Tony Benn. None of them would be allowed in Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And you can say the same for the Tory, like Dominic Grieve, not allowed in Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. Now, because he has ideas which were heretical, we're becoming a much less generous place. We have to conform to all sorts of, all kinds of it's very interesting how public discourse has narrowed in the last 20 years. It's quite recent. And I think it's a terrible thing. I think we're really diminishing ourselves as a country. And it's part of the, I've been allowed to write 5 articles in mainstream British newspapers in the last 4 years. and it's quite odd, this. I was a mainstream figure, but you have people are being driven out of public discourse. It'd be very good for me, by the way, to not to be allowed in, because in ways you have to conform to certain accepted doctrines. And one of which, of course, is not to criticize the British media, which is a great bastion of free speech. And if you challenge this idea, it's quite hard to exist. So I want to just give a few, 2 or 3. How much longer about you want me to speak for, Rector? How long have I been speaking for? In that case, I'm not. I'm going to draw with a reflection that the big reflection is, the final reflection of this is that if you look at polling, British Muslims come highest in loving being British. It's quite more than sort of any other group, I think I'm right in saying. And it's because they understand that being British is to be part of a country, a community, a tradition, a set of ideas where you don't have to, like the French insist, be a friend. In France, French is a way of doing it. And being a national religion, you have all to be secular, and otherwise you're a menace to the state. Britain allows you to be yourself. You can be black and British, gay and British, Jewish and British, Scottish and British, and so on. And that has been the big idea of Britishness, which is absolutely under threat now, in all sorts of different ways. That generosity that, as Queen Elizabeth I, the other great British monarch, said, we don't seek for windows in men's souls. And I'm very happy to take a question or two if you would like me to do that, Rector.
Well, Peter, thank you very much indeed for that very most interesting talk. Very much appreciated. So I'm going to throw it open to any questions from the audience.
Hello. First, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I just have more of two comments, really. One is about Sharia law, because I found what you said about deconstructing concepts or discourse that is used by the government is absolutely fantastic. But at the same time, I do feel like Sharia law also need to be looked at from the margin instead of the center, because at the end of the day, there is absolutely no book that says this is what Sharia law is. It's a bunch of scholars that got together and they said, all right, this is what we think God intended in his book, which is the Quran. So to say that there is Sharia law, like a book that says this is what you should follow, there isn't such a book. It's just like scholars that sort of work just to get it. And also in Sharia law, it does say that you should respect the law of the land where you live. So that's the first comment. The second is to do with Palestine. You mentioned, for instance, if you protest the human rights transgressions in Palestine, soon you'd be accused of being fundamentalist Islamist. Is that what the comment was? Oh yeah, of course.
I just didn't want to sort of be too pontificial once I'd stopped. No, I chucked in Sharia law because it's a difficult subject, and I want to. Obviously, you have to respect the law of the land, and I'm not a scholar. I'm not a great Islamic scholar. But lots of Sharia law is entirely compatible with the law of the land. It is grotesquely misrepresented in the press, cutting off of hand. And there are elements of that, but obviously one is not going to allow Sharia courts to emerge which impose that kind of, but much of Sharia law is like Christian teaching, which is just common sense and about community. And I try to just take away the demonization or the ugly talk, and I liked the way the former Archbishop of Canterbury sort of said, you know, in our country we should allow this. It's not just, I know this isn't a point either which specifically applies to Muslims. Hinduism, Judaism, they've all got elements of law, as does English, as does the Church of England, exemptions from the Human Rights Act, etc. And so does the Jockey Club, for instance, which runs racing. It has its own areas where it can have jurisdiction. And it needs to be balanced and it needs to be talked about. But I'm just simply saying that Sharia law is on this ugly, menacing thing. It's actually part of a very rich part of the teachings of the Prophet, which is part of the mental and community equipment of Muslims. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's about if someone protests against human rights breaches in Palestine, you'd soon be accused of being a fundamentalist or an Islamist. Now, do you think that in using that kind of language, because there is a repressed Christian minority in Palestine that nobody's paying attention to, so basically if you protest about human rights breaches, say, oh, basically you're an Islamist or a fundamentalist, but what about the Christian minorities that are facing the same fate?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with Christians in Palestine. Who are they facing hate from?
Well, generally from, when we talk about...
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. It's a complicated area, and all I meant really is that if a 16-year-old young person expresses support for the Palestinian cause in a classroom, that should not be regarded as something, or as, you know, as something. I don't think we need to get involved in the quite complex issues which you're pointing out there. I just think I was simply giving that as an example, of which there are quite a lot of examples of young people getting involved in, say, the Palestinian cause, or, as I said, sort of going to mosque more often or getting quite religious, when they get hauled up because the teachers or feel an obligation under the prevent duty to question them about having views. When I was a young man, and Britain was a much more tolerant society than I think in many ways, you know, people got involved in combating the Vietnam War. It didn't make them a suspicious person. That I think we're in danger of getting us into a place where ordinary thought is policed. And I think it's actually a good thing if young people get involved in that sort of issue, because that's how they get to define themselves as members of society.
Joyce?
Don't you think it's a bit difficult to regard Islam as homogeneous, because whether it's in the Middle East or in the Far East, there are many different versions of Islam which are in dialogue with one another. What is going on in Afghanistan would be another version of Islam. I mean, all the main faiths are vulnerable to fundamentalism, but I think a particular pressure point for us in Great Britain is the treatment and approach towards women and women's education and women's opportunities amongst our own Islamic population that obviously comes here from various countries where Islam is the prevalent religion. But you know, if you are in a school and there is a conflict between the parents at home that don't want the daughter to go on a school trip, that want the girl to go into a particular Islamic kind of secondary school where she'll be groomed for only domestic life, then we do have a problem.
What you're suggesting, I don't know about these schools you're talking about where young women, girls are sent off to special schools. That's against the law of the land. It's, I'd like to, I don't think they do. And if they do, they're illegal. And of course, any right-thinking person would condemn them. I did a lot of work on the Trojan horse schools in East Birmingham, where that sort of allegation was being made, that the Trojan horse schools were run by a coterie of Islamists who were determined to impose conventional, should we say, backward values on young women. And what was fascinating is, even though these allegations, that sort of allegation was made, they were never substantiated, and they collapsed when they got to court. And in fact, the young women in the Trojan horse schools performed better academically than the boys. Now, if there are such schools which you're talking about, that's obviously completely wrong, and I don't even think there are all sorts of schools of it. Going back to your other point about there being all sorts of different traditions within Islam, absolutely, there are. And what the Taliban is up to, the closure of schools. I'm a trustee of education charity in Afghanistan. You can't. Of course, that should be condemned. But I don't think. I'd like to know more about these schools you suggest exist, because I'm not sure that they can do it legally in this country.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I have more of a eternal question, really, something that puzzles me about the motivation of God in creating Islam, because the Christian belief is that Jesus was the ultimate truth that had evolved out of monotheism and Judaism and the ancient religions to bring about a more compassionate spirituality. And I believe that his sacrifice was for everyone, not just for people who call themselves Christians. I don't believe he would mind what we called ourselves as long as we're loving people. So as you said previously, all monotheistic religions are of that same loving intent. But what puzzles me from an historical point of view, if Jesus is the ultimate symbol of how to be as a person, as a human being, I'm puzzled about what Islam adds. And I've tried to think this through, that what God was about in adding something to adding something that seemed to have perfected everything. And the only thing I would like to know, what perhaps you and the rector and other people think, the only idea that I can come up with, and I've thought about this with the holy month of Ramadan approaching, is that perhaps Christian believers had become a little lax in their disciplines. And I feel quite humbled when I see people in my local area in Keighley fasting, and when Ramadan takes place during heat waves, and I think of people in Yemen digging the roads and fasting. That seems to me something extremely humbling. And that's the only thing I can perhaps come up with, that perhaps God thought we needed a reminder about how to be a bit more disciplined, and I just wondered what perhaps you and the rector thought about that.
Well, thank you very much. They're very interesting. I'm very happy to deal with interfaith, the correlation between how we understand them and how you can approach that. It's a really, really interesting question. But I agree with you, Islam is very disciplined in its faith, praying 5 times a day. Boy, that's monastic level, and that's done across society as a whole. It's phenomenal, but it's Peter's show. So I'll hand back to Peter.
Yeah, I think, well, Jesus comes out very well of the Quran, as you know. In fact, there's more about Mary, mother of Jesus, in the Quran than there is in the Gospels. And Isa, Jesus, is greatly revered and acknowledged as a great prophet within the Quran. So there is quite a similar. There's quite a similar kind of analysis, really. You ask why the need for a final prophet. Well, the ultimate word of God. I'm a Christian, and I have to say that even though the Christ himself is an amazing example, and I've reflected upon his life a great deal, as far as my interpretation, well, he's very explicit, really. He's a sort of revolutionary communist, isn't he, in general outlook and teaching. And he's really advocating a form of social anarchism, I think, where we can live together, look after the poor and the vulnerable, and it's an amazing teaching. I feel that the world will never be settled until that teaching has gone everywhere. But it's the Islam teaches the same thing, really. Love your neighbour.
I'll come back to you. I'll ask Pat first, and then come back to you.
Excuse me. Did you mention something about Indonesia? And if so, what did you say? Did you mention something about Indonesia? And if so, what did you say?
I don't feel capable of talking about Indonesia. I mean, you are right. There's an enormous Muslim population, and I'm told it works quite well, but I haven't been there. I don't want to.
For somebody who worked in the Westminster Village many years ago, I know exactly the think tanks you're talking about. I would term them unsavoury. And my question would be, how have they been allowed to create this narrative or have this sort of monopoly over the language that they are creating? How have they been allowed to have such power?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, if you look at the recent stuff that's been going on, you have to be a bit of a Westminster nerd to do that. But it's been quite an important year. The last few months, we've had the Shawcross report into the Prevent strategy. Willie Shawcross is actually a very nice man. He's wrote a very good biography of the Queen Mother, which I thought was gravely underestimated. But he was, I think I'm right in saying, in the Henry Jackson Society, and in which capacity he made some quite dramatic remarks which essentially reflected the so-called Great Replacement theory, which is that there's an immense existential threat to the West from Islam. And he did his report, which generally speaking endorsed the general thinking and analysis of Islamism and all these key phrases I tried to discuss. He then advocated the special role for something called the Commission for Countering Extremism, run by a man called Simcox, also ex-Henry Jackson Society. And it does stagger me that these quite unknown, apart from by you and me, these funny organizations are so influential in creating the way in which Muslim organizations in Britain are going to be policed, when they themselves have so many questions to be asked about them and are, in any case, I would say, structurally Islamophobic, these organizations and the individuals who are given these jobs. They get away with it, to answer your question, because this method of thinking has captured the British mainstream press. And so, if you looked at the Prevent Strategy report by Willie Shawcross, everything in it almost had been leaked to the Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch, who is he doesn't like Muslims. I mean, and the man who created Fox News, and the Telegraph Group and the Mail Group and so on. And so there is a sort of tiny little group, a hugely influential group of the main papers, the Conservative Party, which buys into this nonsense and is structurally Islamophobic in a grotesque way. I mean, if you look at polling of the Conservative Party membership, it's quite shattering what their views on Muslims are terrifying, in fact. And so you get a Conservative Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, taking a report by Willie Shawcross, who I don't think quite understood what he was up to, but he comes from the Henry Jackson Society, giving a boost to somebody else, Simcox, who comes from the Henry Jackson Society, then gets written up by these right-wing British press as being a tremendously good report. And it's a very circular situation. And the report also is very menacing in terms of civil society Muslim organizations, which are then singled out within it as being critics of Prevent and therefore potentially subversive, and there's a sort of hint that they may have to be punished for that. It's bizarre. And no other religious or any other minority that I can think of in Britain has to put up with this kind of thing. And if you say what I'm saying, you're sort of presenting yourself as some form of subversive who is potentially a threat, an enemy of the state. There is a sort of an emerging authoritarianism here, which is profoundly un-British. I mean, just the opposite of what this country actually stands for. And they do it all in the name of fundamental British values.
Any more questions? Peter, that's perhaps an appropriate point for me to say a few words. I just think, you've had your career in journalism has been very celebrated and very distinguished, and I think what the theme that's coming across to me is the ability to get behind the public narrative. In other words, you're presented with one way of thinking, and really good journalism in any story is getting behind that and seeing where that truth lies. And that applies equally to politics in whatever form, but equally to Islam. We're presented with a public discourse which we're supposed to embrace. And I think all of us, anyone who's free-thinking and interested in truth, should always seek to try and get behind that narrative. In my own world, I have a cousin who teaches in a university in Paris. People wear the niqab, the hijab, and he says they're feminists. It totally upends the narrative we've been given about oppressed Muslim women. I did a lot of work on the just war in Christianity and Islam. You can see that NATO is based on the concept of collective self-defense. Yet if a Muslim goes to help his Muslim brother, which is part of the Islamic tradition, he's a terrorist. Shamima Begin goes out, she's naive, she's a child, and vilified. I think there are all sorts of things that we have to interrogate with a far greater thoroughness than we do, and the sheer hypocrisy of the British state saying, I go to the local primary school and it says on the board, British values the rule of law. I was sitting on the Iraqi border this time 20 years ago, about to breach international law on behalf of the state. We rip up treaties. We're about to shred the refugee treaty. And the sheer hypocrisy of telling primary school children that the British value of obeying the rule of law, yeah, come off it. But Peter, I'm hugely indebted to you for coming up today to speak to us. I'm very honoured that you came all this way since we first met a decade ago, and we've had some interesting debates and some good cricket in the meantime. And it's a very controversial subject, particularly in a very conservative setting such as this. But you've challenged us in all sorts of ways